The portal is a living, thinking community. Becoming a member of the portal gives you access to 4 live events every month, but more importantly, an opportunity to learn how to think with others, to learn with online creators and para academics, and to develop your own capacity as a philosopher. Becoming a member of the portal also gives you access to the history of our recordings, as well as discount access on past and future courses. This year, members also get exclusive access to the Slovenian School Reading Group, as well as the year-long course focused on Deleuze and analysis. To learn more or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Ross Byrd. Ross is a public writer through Patient Kingdom on Substack, which I'll link below. He focuses on the riddle-like nature of the kingdom of God and the unfolding mystery of divine and human agency. Patient Kingdom is about why God seems to hide and how we can learn to see and hear him even in an increasingly noisy world. I think starting off, I also want to say that Ross was a part of the Christianity in Transition series in the Portal, along with Christian Baxter, as well as Rob Zahn. The Christianity in Transition series was a 2-month process in the Portal where we were just basically exploring contemporary trends and movements in Christianity. And Ross presented on a paper that he wrote for the Patient Kingdom titled A Parish Manifesto. So in this conversation, we will be reflecting a little bit on our time in the Portal about Christianity in Transition, but we also hope to get into discussions about contemporary Christianity in evangelical, or what is being called metagelical spaces, and excited to talk to you. So Ross, welcome to the channel, and really enjoyed the Christianity in Transition series with you. Maybe let's just start with how you're thinking, or what you thought about the month in the Portal.
Thanks. It was, first off, it was just an honor to be a part of it. Great guests and just a great portal of people with awesome questions every single week, open to the kinds of conversations that I'm interested in having. And so I felt like, wow, this is a bunch of great people to have that kind of a conversation with. And obviously, in some ways, different people than I'm often having them with, since I'm from more of a traditional Christian background and community. It was great to see people exploring it from mostly, I guess, outside Christianity, or else outside of, traditional Christian community. And so that helped me to see things and shape things, and to even challenge the way that I communicate things and think about things in a different way. So I really, really enjoyed it. Appreciate being invited to it, and also appreciated just our little conversations during it about what community and sort of the future of, I don't know, economics and family and household looks like. And so it was a great time.
I think your angle and emphasizing what you were talking about in the Parish Manifesto was really bringing to the forefront local community and physical organizing and the role of the church in that. Maybe you could unpack for people, because I'll leave a link in the description to your article, A Parish Manifesto, about maybe what you're trying to do with that article, and why you think it's important that we focus on this issue of local community organizing and what's at stake there.
Yeah, sure. So I am writing from a mainline background, I guess. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, but I have grown up evangelical in the sense that my church itself sort of went through an evangelical revival when I was in my teenage years. And so even though I grew up with maybe more of your typical traditional don't talk about your personal relationship with Jesus type of church, it became also about a personal relationship with Jesus as I got older. And so I feel like in a lot of ways, I sort of had the best of all worlds, is the way that I think of it. Even though church is very hard, and our church went through terrible things as well, and scandals, and even a kind of church split over sexuality issues when I was later, or when I was in my early 20s. And I was actually on staff there. So I see myself mostly now not really writing to a mainline audience, but to an evangelical audience. To my peers, I am still just very much a part of the the evangelical movement of the church, although that word is beginning to lose meaning in some senses. But the Parish Manifesto is kind of a proposal to my fellow traditional Christians, or especially evangelical Christians, to begin to rethink church with me, or to maybe begin to imagine that the forms that we've been using for church are becoming, let's say, unsustainable. There's been an oversaturation of a certain movement, and the movement needs to go another way, which I propose is towards holiness again, and towards attention to forms. If the evangelical movement in America was, I think it was mostly attention to content, it was saying, look, we have all these forms, priests and robes and liturgies and all these things, but is there really a spirit underneath this? Like, do we really love God? Which is actually quite a prophetic message. I mean, this is what a number of the prophets say, that God says through the prophets, I don't want your sacrifices anymore. I was the one who set up this system for you, but now it's just empty rituals. I want your love. So he says, I desire love, not sacrifice. And I think that's what, the Billy Grahams of the world were saying in the 20th century. And so I think that was right. But what happens sometimes is that when you have let's say a content-centric movement, or even you might say a spirit-centric movement, spirit in the lowercase s sense, you can lose body. You can lose, a soul needs a body. And you end up, I guess, adopting whatever body is nearby. But in that case, it's been storefronts and warehouses and whatever we could fill. It's been so much attention to content, meaning the words and the theology. And the spirit of that, there's kind of almost, you could say, two streams within evangelicalism now. One is a more, I call it like an explanation-centric mode of church, which is the more highly theological ones. A lot of Reformed thinkers would be in that camp. And then the other is a more experience-centric church, which would be more about experiencing God, the presence of God in worship. It's often a lot more musically inclined, even can feel, let's say those who are complaining about it would say it feels like a rock concert or something like that. But both those movements are alive. My own church is actually very good at both of those things. But even combining experience and explanation is not exactly what I'm talking about, because they're both very content centric, and they're still not quite paying attention to the forms that they have left behind and the forms that they're accidentally giving rise to. And so we're all liturgical beings. We're all kind of like creatures of habit. We're all orbiting beings is the way that I talk about it. But if you don't pay attention to the way that you are orbiting, no matter what you're saying, the orbit still says more. The orbit will say and do a lot. And so that's kind of what the Parish Manifesto is calling people back to, is paying attention once again to forms, and proposing that to some degree the mainline forms of priests and liturgies and beautiful spaces that are set apart for holy worship and prayer are good things, and they don't need to look like they did in the past, but they should be paid attention to again. Even things like graveyards and weddings and potlucks within the church, as opposed to just renting out spaces elsewhere because we paid no attention to spaces for so long we don't even want to get married in our own churches. All those kinds of things, I think, invite a kind of new continuity and consistency and embodiment to the people of God that our evangelical moment has lost. And if we're not careful, that disembodiment, I think, leads to a lot more disembodiment, let's say to deconstruction, away from the church, and to a kind of identity crisis, which I would say we are there. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I think coming at it from a philosophical perspective, and for the sake of my audience, I think that it's really interesting to focus on how you're centering forms. And of course, forms here coming from Platonic philosophy as a foundation for philosophical thinking. The concept of form runs all the way throughout philosophy. And maybe here, of course, form connected to beauty. And maybe you're thinking about forms in relationship to the true, the good, and the beautiful in that way. And maybe just starting with that, are you drawing on resources from a Platonic perspective, or are there other philosophical perspectives that you're inspired by or thinking about here, bringing into deeper contact with the evangelical tradition?
Yeah, it's definitely related to Plato, that's for sure, and to Aristotle to some degree. The way that he resolves the form slightly differently. I think I have more just begun with the Christian tradition, which is it's something like the way the church fathers talked about it was the marriage of opposites. They say that sort of all reality, in a sense, exists to the degree that that heaven and earth come together. So we talked about this a little bit in the portal, but in Genesis 1, you see that the way that the earth is created, well, the very first line of the Bible is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the very first line actually introduces two things, not one. And then all the ways that the description of creation happens is this kind of bifurcation. There's like land and sea, there's the light and the dark. There's even fish and birds are created at the same time, which is a little bit odd at first, but then you see, it's like a above and belowness to almost everything that's going on in that account, which I take to be a philosophical account, really. Like it's not, at least it's not a physical account in the sense that it's not giving you a physics description of how the earth was made in the modern sense. It's trying to tell you more about how, let's say, attention and cognition and how reality is shaped both by consciousness and physical reality at the same time. And so, anyway, the the thing that I'm trying to do philosophically is I'm trying to bring this aboveness and belowness into marriage and union with each other. And so if you end up with a movement that is, let's say, too heady or too much theology, too much content, and not enough form, meaning like actual embodied practice of those high theological ideals, then you are not doing what, let's say, humans were meant to do. Because at the end of the Genesis account, it's human beings that are made as this microcosm, this marriage of heaven and earth, because we are dust and breath. So we are, whereas everything else in the account is kind of above or below, we are above and below. We are both dust and breath. And so we are, and it's almost sadly so, because we're sort of this painful living prophecy of the very end of the Bible. The end of the Bible is the marriage of heaven and earth. Revelation 21 is sort of like when the New Jerusalem comes down, and God is married to his people. We are this living, breathing prophecy of that thing which is to come. But we ourselves are so, almost you could define sin in a sense as the tendency to be disintegrated, the tendency for heaven and earth to be once again separated, for them to not find their home in each other. And so really, that's where it's coming from for me philosophically, is that the call of the Christian is to have body and soul meet, to have God and his creation meet, to have thought world and act world be integrated in the most ultimate way that they can be. And so that's what I mean when I talk about forms. And so the form that is, let's say, most central to my argument in a Parish Manifesto is literally just the word parish, and that's the kind of central word to the argument, just means neighborhood. And so I start there by saying, look, before you're talking about priests or vestments or steeples or anything like that, just start by saying that our church should actually be localized in bodies, in human bodies and in their neighbors. The two main calls from God are to love God and love neighbor, says Jesus. And the first, I guess, is quite a mystery. You could argue about how we are to love God. But the second is impossible if you don't have neighbors. So, and we're living in a world where increasingly we don't have neighbors, or we don't exactly even know who they are. And so it's sort of reclaiming the neighborhood, I guess, as a form in which to then have neighbors, in which to then obey God through loving them and loving him. So
the axiom that was coming to my mind while you were speaking in, sort of the last 10 minutes is really this idea, and pointing towards what you're emphasizing with disembodiment and the dualism between spirit and body, is that Hegel has this line that's spirit is a bone. But spirit is a bone. You could just simplify, say spirit is a body. And even someone like Nietzsche's emphasizing that spirit is a body. And
yeah.
And I think I'm trying to interpret Nietzsche kind of in a Christian atheist way, because I think there are resources in Nietzsche that can be quite useful for Christians and atheists, but of course he always gets labeled as an atheist. And
Yeah,
fair
I
enough.
completely agree. Yeah.
But just this, I want to just emphasize this unity between spirit and body as kind of this key dimension that you're trying to bring out. And I think that there are many resources in modern philosophy that we've been drawing on in Philosophy Portal that are going in a similar direction, basically. And at the same time, what's so crazy about our time, and for me, it's like such a good example of it because I'm not living in my home country.
Hmm.
I'm living in France. I'm living abroad. I've been abroad since about 2014. I'm very much unrooted, and have been in a process of unrooting since 2014, and now trying to plant
Mm.
roots again,
Yes.
and in physical context. But practically speaking, with Philosophy Portal and with all my connections and collaborations, so many great people all over the world, and my local neighborhood is basically strangers. Like, I don't
Right.
really even
Right.
know my neighbors. And so that creates such a strange split where it's hard to know how to really reroute a neighborhood when, practically speaking, everyone is connecting with so many people everywhere, but never in our local context. So, what are the stakes of that challenge? And practically speaking, are you finding a way to wed heaven and earth with the with the internet and your local communities, and how has that process unfolded for you?
I mean, you're not alone, right? I mean, I would say that everyone is living in a, I mean, maybe you're a more extreme version of it because you're in France, but um, everyone is living in that kind of disintegration to one degree or another at this moment. Maybe not everyone, but maybe not some tribal peoples in certain places, but most of us have become kind of floating individuals in a nation state, as opposed to people of a village, and then of a, or let's say of a household, and then of a neighborhood, and then of a village, and then of a state. And so those that let's say the Russian nesting doll version of reality is what I'm aiming to bring back, because if you don't have small steps of continuity between between your concept of self and then the entire world, if it's basically just like me and the globe, which is sort of what the internet is, it's like I, as just self, am going to get on to the universe.
Yeah.
Every time you go on the internet,
Yeah.
then it's concerningly disintegrating. And so I was going to say disillusioning, but it's almost the opposite of a disillusion. It is an illusion. It is an illusion that there are no steps in between those. And so
A concerning illusion.
a concerning illusion, yes.
Yeah.
And so I do see it that way. I do see it as, and it's not as though illusions don't become real. Illusions do become real, and we're living in one of those times. But I do see it as an illusion to some degree. The kinds of, I don't mean this to say anything negative about the internet or about the communities that we're building online, but they are illusory to the degree that they cannot give you a kind of Russian nesting doll continuity with reality. And so let's say that you have yourself and you have your internet community. I would say, don't say, well, internet community bad. I would just say, try to sort of build back or build forward from self, so that there's more connection, more connecting points between the two, so that there's continuity between let's say your internet self and yourself, because yourself is still a body. It still is a person from a place with a family and a background and a tradition. Before we started recording, we were talking about kids and grandparents and the connections that we have to them and to their names and to their legacies. All those things, I think we forget at our peril, because we're still carrying them all around. It's like having a father that you hate so much that all you want to do is get away from him. But then you realize once you get away from him that he's been living in you. And so now this thing that you could have somehow leveraged, because you can't get rid of the father within you, you're now sort of just carrying around as a burden instead of leveraging it for some kind of slingshot to move you forward. It's just like this weight that you're always carrying. And so I don't know. I guess that's kind of how I see us, as people who are carrying around our bodies even right now, because we refuse to live in them. and carrying around the burden of our neighbors, because we would be so much more fulfilled if we knew that we were needed by them. And so much of our unhappiness and depression and anxiety, I think, comes from, let's say, if you wanted to put it simply, the desire to be needed. And the internet doesn't really need any of us in the sense that I'm talking about. But once you become a consumer of things, you become a needer, but not needed. You need everything. You have to, I have to get this and I have to get that, and you can get it all over the place. But then you wonder why you're so unhappy. You've consumed everything you want to consume. Why do you feel so empty after consuming all these things? It's because one of the deepest hungers is to be needed. And it's very hard to fulfill that need without, like I said, a more continuous Russian nesting doll approach, where you actually see who's very nearby. That's the kind of person who oftentimes needs you the most. So that's, I don't know if I really answered your question, but that's what I'm aiming at.
It's a huge challenge. I do see it as a positive challenge. I think it's a huge challenge.
Agreed.
But I do think it's a positive challenge before us. Specifically, like, let's talk about, for example, the history of industrial production has in many ways led to the erasure of us needing each other in the organic links and the familial links that we constitute traditional society, let's say. And industrial production always creates this tension. And today, of course, we're dealing with it in the context largely of digitality, the internet, and artificial intelligence. And, my background in academia, of course, there was the passion for knowledge and the passion for learning that was driving my investigations and my adventure there. But deep down, like you're saying, there's also this dimension of being needed. And I think a lot of academics don't think too hard about the fact that actually deep down, whether they're writing papers or giving presentations or teaching classes or whatever it is they're doing, there is this feeling like I want to be needed. And I want to feel seen and recognized, and I want my work to have a valuable impact on others. And I think that with the way I've seen artificial intelligence over the last 5 years develop, I can already sort of see the erosion of the need for the way in which, for example, the professor functioned in the 20th century. Now that brings a huge question, like, does that mean that we'll just get rid of professors, or we don't need professors anymore, we don't need teachers anymore? I don't think that's the answer. I think we need to rethink, what does it mean to be a teacher, or what does it mean to be a professor in this context, and what do humans need, and this dynamic. So, also to be, of course, to be and needed, of course, and then also to be desired. And I think maybe the sexes and like kind of the sexual tension between men and women today also is raising this question of the desire to be wanted. How does that I think we have to rethink all of that from the ground up. And maybe I'm also thinking about your project, and then I'll throw it back to you, but thinking about your project is that I know in the portal we were talking about the mega church phenomenon, and I know that part of the year you kind of tend to mega church, and then on the other hand, we both have some contact with the TLC, this little corner, which is more of an online community space. And again, the Parish Manifesto of emphasizing the local neighborhood is kind of like between those two. It's not the big scaled up mega church, but it's not also the terminally online. And one of the things that you were emphasizing that I thought was really interesting was that we're also, because of the internet, spoiled for exceptionalism and talent. And that part of this, going back to the local context, is, you were saying in the local church, like, having people who are bad at music playing the music, or people who are bad at singing playing doing the singing, that we have to sort of be with, the full range of humanity. I'm actually reminded of, you see Paul Vanderklay in his local church context. He's hanging out with like homeless guys and just hanging out with them in their rapping and stuff like that. And it's funny, but it that seems to me like what you're talking about is like, actually just being with the full range of humanity and your neighbors, and that might not be like where we self-select the best and the brightest from around the world to organize a digital community.
Totally. One of the things I love about, one of the things that first drew me to Paul Vanderklay this is going to sound weird at first, but it was actually that he complained so much about the homeless guys that he was caring for. And that was what first drew me to him, because you can tell when someone has reached to a place where they have an actual constant local relationship with the same homeless people, they can actually get to a place where it's no longer romanticized. Like, oh, we need to help the poor. It's like, it's actually a pain. Like, you took a dump on my step last night and now I have to clean it up, but I'm also going to continue this relationship with you. He knows all their names. He knows like some of their family background or whatever. That's when I was like, this guy's legit, because you can tell that there's a certain, and I've done this in my life. I work with the homeless quite a bit. There's a certain way of doing that where you've only grabbed onto the spirit of helping the poor, let's say, and you're sort of still living in the honeymoon period of like, isn't this great that I'm doing this thing? But if you actually do it, what you'll find is that no, it's not great. Like, it doesn't make you feel great about yourself. You kind of feel like if you're not complaining on the internet, like Paul does sometimes. And again, I'm giving you a compliment by this. Then you're at least complaining in your own mind about it. You're saying like, these stupid, ungrateful people, like I've done so much for them. But that's actually what it's like to have neighbors, and to have neighbors who are really in need and who actually need even that, 3-minute kind of crazy conversation that so-and-so had with Paul yesterday, after dumping some trash in his yard. Paul was like, hey, come pick up your trash or whatever. Those kinds of things, at least in my experience, that's where real life is. And that's the kind of embodied life that I'm talking about.
So I think that example of the cleaning up the shit, like a homeless guy just shit on your church property or something like that. It's the perfect example, because I've never even said this to anyone, but last year, our literal neighbor in our apartment building was getting drunk and literally throwing his shit into our backyard.
Oh my gosh.
And we obviously just went to go like this. And I think I don't know for sure, but the person doing it has some sort of mental issue.
Yeah, that's some primal behavior.
That's primal behavior. And but I'm just saying, but like, that is neighbors. Like,
that's real.
That's for real. Like, I grew up in a townhouse and our neighbors were crazy. So it really is that. And in many ways, I think with the online and the digitality, where we are trying to insulate or self-enclose from the shit of life. And
yes,
and we're trying to sort of manage these kind of digital quasi, not perfect relationships, but these self-selected relationships where we're looking for people. And I do think that there's something important about that. Like, I do think I'm incredibly privileged to be able to have these conversations with you, even though we're across the ocean, and all these other people that we're interacting with. There is a privilege there, but in some sense, yeah, your work is pointing us to not forget that the shit, the head and the anus.
Because you can exactly because you can see how your philosophy would end up suffering from that, right? Like, if you mean philosophy, hopefully in the fullest sense of like our appreciation for true wisdom, for how to see the world aright, you could see how over time, if let's say you're doing your morality online, well, then of course it's going to become a projection of morality that isn't necessarily tested by being lived. And so much of this is kind of what I was getting back to about love neighbor. Online, the ethic is not love your neighbor, it's love everyone. But the trouble with saying something like love everyone is that it's never tested. You can't test that. I mean, if you did test it, you would fail. Nobody loves everyone. And there's no such thing as love everyone. There's only such a thing as love neighbor or hate neighbor, I guess, or ignore neighbor, or, something in between there. And
love,
so
hate, and indifference.
Love, hate, and indifference. But to love everyone is to begin to live in a kind of illusion. And I hopefully I'm not going to be heard wrong here. I still think the ideal is to love everyone that you come across. I think that God loves everyone, but
that's
the way to love everyone.
Radical particularity, like of meeting.
Yes, exactly.
It's not some abstract. I love 7 billion people on the planet.
Correct. And so it has to, it's like the Russian nesting dolls. It has to scale. It has to start somewhere. If you can't actually love your household, or even, like, it's weird to say it, but even the person throwing shit in your lawn next door to you, it's it's not going to be as real as you think when you love everyone else, because you need to, if you want your love to be real, then it needs to be in the places where reality is most. And nobody wants to live in the Truman Show world, but we all kind of do. And I guess that was the second point I was going to make, is there's this fine line between reality and a kind of simulacrum of reality that does almost the same thing for you. Like it almost gives you the same sort of hit. Like we were talking about being needed. There's something like the desire to be needed can almost be satiated by the desire to be consumed, right? And so if you could talk about this with a professor or with a porn star online or something like that, where they sort of begin with this desire to be needed. And then they realize, oh, if I just sort of get famous by giving out this thing that people consume, it will almost fill the hunger of being needed. But they're not the same thing. And the trouble with so much of our sort of digital lives now is that we can't see the difference between those two things. And that's why we're so unhappy.
So one of the things that I've done as kind of a defense mechanism is, in regards to this distinction, not being able to tell the difference, is when I started my YouTube channel, in some sense, my work was being consumed in a way that it wasn't in just the university context alone. But at the same time, I knew that if I just stayed on YouTube, or if I just had this be solely a surface level internet phenomenon, that it wouldn't make this distinction to the deeper level of actually being needed. So that's kind of the origin of setting up Philosophy Portal. That's the origin of setting up, because then you could actually have teacher-student relationships. You can have deeper collaborations with other people. And I think is important, of course, it's not a big deal. We're doing this conversation. It's going to be put on YouTube. But I do think it's important to have spaces where actually your conversations are not going to be put on YouTube, and they're just they're in for that private context. And so that's why the portal is to create those contexts where, that this conversation is not going to be on YouTube, and it has a different vibe. I think it's because it's for a different audience. It's for
it really did.
Present.
It did. I could tell it was attractive to me for that reason.
So just this distinction, getting at this distinction between being like a consumable digital object versus creating context where we're actually needed and we need each other. And I think that we have to be creative and artistic with creating those spaces. Like, how do we create those spaces? Because there's a lot of talent, there's a lot of interesting people, but I think that we are lacking in relationship to the form and in relationship to the orbit of that form, of creating context for being needed and needing each other. I think that's like that's a deep creative challenge today. And I see that these online communities, whether it's the communities that are more close to me, or whether it's the TLC or other communities, I think that's what I would really like to see in the years to come, is in many ways using these media that are a tremendous advantage to create contexts where we find new needs and desires for communion, ultimately, you could say, I guess.
Yes.
And coming together. So, I mean,
sorry, let me just
is there anything you want to say to
something
that?
In response to that? But I was thinking again about what you were talking about AI and your term about like a positive problem. And in a sense, you can see AI itself as a kind of positive problem that sort of challenges you again to say, what is a human being exactly? If AI can do this, this, and this, if it's going to teach my philosophy classes for me, and write the students' papers for them, what is there that is not, what is non-artificial intelligence? What is actual intelligence? What is a human being? And I guess my argument would be that I don't know that we can really tell right now, because I think that we have become artificial intelligences to a large degree. And just like ChatGPT works really well at what it does, it's working really well for us in the sense that we don't have a lot of motives to quit being digital persons at this point. But I just wonder, I think as you can already sort of sense the consequences in a professor not needing to teach his classes because AI can do it for him, and the student not needing to write the papers because AI can do it for them too. You can already sense the tension of like, wait, but then who learns anything? Or who teaches anything? Who is where is the relationship? Are we even relational beings?
Breaks down. Like our
right.
basic presuppositions break down.
Correct. And so it's my suspicion that a decade or two from now, maybe longer, whereas now, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. Whereas now, let's say we're attracted to fame. Like, this is the best chess player in the world. I'd almost rather watch him play chess than even like play chess with my own friends. We talked about this on the portal a little bit about how once you start playing chess online, it sort of begins to erase your ability to play chess in a human way with like your own son or your best friend or your dad or whatever, because now you're at such, the more you obsessively play chess online, the more you become, a really good chess player. And then it's just not fun to play with anyone who isn't some random anonymous person from Hong Kong that you're playing at 2 a.m. And so if that's the case, I think maybe right now we're still in a moment where it's attractive to us to play the person in Hong Kong at 2 a.m. But I just wonder if eventually what will be attractive to us is the kinds of people that maybe not refused to do that, but they committed so much to playing chess with their friends and their family that over the course of 20 years, they have like a whole community of like just explosively amazing chess players that are thinking of things that nobody thought to do on a chessboard or something like that. To me, that's the kind of future that I really believe in, and that I think we could see is that it takes quite a bit of discipline to step back from, let's say, the almost immediate fruit and fame that you could have by being consumed, and to play, this is what I'm always talking about, right? The patient kingdom, to play the long game with making the people around you the ones that you are blessing, and then having eyes to see how they are the ones that bless you, and then letting that scale. I think it could still scale to some kind of global level where people are like, oh my gosh, what is happening there? So it's not as though I'm against scaling beyond a village. I just think if you skip steps, you end up building something that doesn't have a foundation, and it's going to, to use Jesus's words, when the storm comes, it's built on sand instead of on the rock, and so it falls.
That challenge is definitely before me. I am constantly speculating about how to tackle it, in part because of my location. It makes it a little bit more challenging, but I'm totally with you on that's where things are going, and that necessarily has to go in that direction.
And even on the internet, you can still do that, right? You found ways to make small scale on the internet. So I'm not saying like anything that's being done on the internet is bad. I'm writing on the internet too. But when I write on the internet, I try to write for my people first. For my, let's say it's kind of like 50 people, but then it's sort of like 200 people. And then it goes to like however many people are subscribed to my thing that I try not to pay too much attention to, because I still want to write for the 50 and for the 200. So.
Yeah, I was just actually introducing, it's funny enough as well, like I just released a book, and the title cover of the book is actually like a joke related to excrement, and like the book is just in the toilet in the back cover. But there is sort of a joke there about being with the shit. But it just also in the portal last night, actually, we were I was discussing the book, and we're talking about, for example, what is the audience for this book? And I think it's between no one and everyone is like a very specific community. Like, this book isn't for everyone. This book isn't for no one. It's actually for a very specific community. Like, I'm more interested, for example, the example I gave was, I'd be more interested in the people who are regularly attending the portal to read the book than I would be if, I don't know, like Novara Media or some big media company picked up the book and said, let's have a conversation about it. So I think that's kind of the spirit. And I think that spirit is kind of against or not fetishizing fame. And I think we should kind of de-fetishize fame. I know that's something you're thinking about as well. And the example I gave it, because it was related to the book and related to ongoing conversations that we're having, is like, if you pay attention to how quickly, for example, Jordan Peterson became famous, I think it actually could have had negative impact on his work, in the sense that
I
like
think
the
it definitely
work,
did.
right, like I mean, I think that like after talking to many people about this, I think like the general consensus is that the work he was doing in 2015, 2016 was kind of like the peak of, or like the pinnacle of his work, which makes sense because he's at a university doing a lot of research, studying very deeply, probably working on the Maps of Meaning course for decades,
Mhm.
putting it together. And then when you get famous, and then you're sort of constantly in like a you're constantly in a production loop, and
Mhm.
you're constantly sort of responding to all of this noise. It could be very easy to sustain a decades long research project and to continue sort of your deep research. So I think that on the whole, and this is where I find probably my deepest connection with you, is, the concept of the patient kingdom is something that I link to the idea of patience of the concept, which is basically not to be so quick, like to play the long game, and that's where we want to be anyway. Like like the fetishization of growth is totally to be demystified. I think more
Totally.
like sustainability. Like I'm more interested, not can I grow whatever I'm doing in a year to some absurd number, but rather, can I do this for 10 years? Like, can I do this for 20 years? Can I, like, and just in a sustained way with, and at a certain point with scale, like just take the portal, like say we have 20 to 30 members. And what if it scales to 100 members? But maybe in that scaling, we lose something, So I don't know. Those
Yeah.
are kind of where my thoughts are about these things.
Beautiful. I mean, I'm definitely on the same page. Theologically, you could almost say that this is what the Bible is about. Like if you take what causes all the problems, it's really eating of this fruit. Why eat of the fruit? I mean, at least the way that tradition goes is it wasn't, God didn't say don't eat the fruit in the middle of the garden because it was bad. He said don't eat it because it's so good, basically. Because in a sense, he does have a plan for you to have it, but it has to be in the right way, in the right time. And so almost the sin from the very beginning is just impatience. That's almost the whole problem, is that you want to take something that you aren't ready for, that you don't have capacity for, that you can't integrate. And so you actually become disintegrated. And that's part of the meaning of Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil, is that you become, you give rise to a sort of duality that now can't be easily put back together. And the rest of the story of the Bible, in a sense, is how God can reconcile all these things that have been disintegrated. And so, yeah, that's what I think our calling is in the world, is to carefully, patiently reintegrate, restore that which, remember even that which is, separated and alienated. So, yeah, I'm with you. Also,
One of
Jordan
the
Peterson
hardest, sorry,
is.
one of the,
I was just saying.
yeah,
Go.
No,
Okay,
please,
I was just gonna say that Jordan Peterson is a very good
yeah,
example. It's
yeah,
a very good example because I think part of what happened with Jordan Peterson is he might have gotten sharper. So he's, top of his career, but nobody really knows him. Then he comes onto the public spotlight and he's sort of like, in internet language, destroys these pundits who are asking him questions that they have no idea what they're getting into because the dude is
like
sharp.
Kathy, what is it? The Kathy Newman, I think.
Kathy Newman. Yeah. That sort of, it's like, wow, he comes out of nowhere. And then you could say like, all right, well, that's when it started going downhill, but I'm not sure because he also seems to have begun to learn new things by connecting with people outside of academia. So he would, he'd have these long lines at all his talks and he'd listen to some blue collar guy just tell him how his, he started cleaning his room or whatever. And he's, constantly crying. And you can tell that a lot of times his emotion even is around these connections with individuals where I think it is something like being needed. I really think it is that, as opposed to being consumed. I don't think his drive from the beginning was, I want to be consumed. I want to be consumed. He even seemed kind of annoyed, with sort of a lot of the media attention, which of course it was negative, but I think he knew he could handle it. I think it was basically just like, I want to be needed. And he found through these talks that he could connect with people more personally. But then I think over time, it just becomes too much. It's like you can only have so many people need you, you know? And especially in a world that doesn't scale like that. It's not like we have kings anymore. You know, kings could have nobles and nobles or whatever. We don't have that. We have, like I said at the beginning, individuals and states, you know, and maybe above that, the market. And so that's all you have. And so he becomes kind of a slave to the market in a sense, and to fame itself. And I'm not saying this is some deep negative thing about him. I think it's pretty incredible what he did, but it does seem at some point that his own insights begin to kind of plateau, and he's sort of beginning to say the same thing over and over again. And I think for some, at least part of my theory about that is it's because you don't feel needed anymore. You just feel consumed. And then the next thing is just, I don't know what, write another bestseller or just keep giving the talks, but it's, at some point you have to find scale again, you know? And so anyway, that's my 2 cents on Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to me, there's all this utility in understanding like the master-slave dialectic with fame. We think the person who gets all the fame is the master.
Yeah.
But in many ways, they can become enslaved to that. And so there is
Exactly.
that. And, you know, I was actually also moved by Paul Vanderklay's reflections on a video with Christian Baxter at ARC, where he was talking about how his impression of ARC was that they were just putting up all these big names on a stage, but that they weren't actually using the intelligence of the people that came to ARC. And also,
Right.
I wanted to say about ARC is something I think Jordan Hall said about ARC, which is that if you want, and this is about beauty, that if you wanted to host the end of civilization in a like the aesthetics of a certain architecture of the building, you would do it in the building that they did at ARC.
Exactly.
Just meaning that it was a very ugly building. So
no attention to forms. It's the
no
same thing.
attention to forms,
Yeah.
and no attention to actual the intelligence of the community, or I would say I think you could also say the intelligence of the Holy Spirit that was there congregating and communing. So, and I took that as a principle for Wake because we were doing events at Wake. And one of the things we're saying, we're not just platforming big names. You sort of need some function where some names are talking. But the way we designed it was to have it go into these small breakout groups where ultimately the opening presentations or discussions were meant to filter down into these breakout groups where you could have actual community dialogue and sort of intersharing and interparticipation between all the people at the conference. So I think that basically came out of my impression or interpretation from Paul Vanderklay's reception of ARC, which is that you're just having all these names on a stage, but you didn't, like, for example, build it like, and so I think he was doing that with estuary work of building a smaller group to go into that. So I think there's another thing I wanted to say, but if there's anything there that's alive for you, maybe we could go off.
No, go on. I've been talking too much.
So I was also wanted to say about the sin of impatience and the sin of impatience with your metaphor of the tree and the fruit in the garden, and that God has a plan that you don't know, you can't see it, but he has a plan that you will get the fruit. You just have to have patience. And it's about right timing and right order. And I think that this is so hard. Of course, I've learned this being an impatient 20-something, where I see someone with the fruit that I want, and I don't know how he got it, or I don't know how to get it. And I act in an embarrassing way, or I act in a way that now retroactively I think was immature, let's say. And the hard thing is when you see the younger guys, when you see that now it's reversed, where let's say a younger guy thinks you have a fruit that he wants. And I think it's all about this father-son relationship metaphorically. And how do we navigate that? Because I think the stakes of navigating the metaphor of the father and the son in regards to the fruit, or you could say God and Adam, in relationship to the fruit, this is very helpful and very insightful to be aware that these dynamics are constantly unfolding. But it seems, and probably here we're again aligned, that the patient kingdom depends on understanding this dynamic.
It does. And so one way you could say it is that there actually is a sin beneath impatience, a more fundamental sin, which is something like distrust. So because the way that God sets it up is he doesn't even say be patient. Then I guess the sin would be impatience, or maybe still it would be what I'm about to say, but he just says don't eat it. And so then the test, in a sense, is, and he doesn't give a rationale, and it's actually brilliant. I was just talking to the class that I teach on Friday about this. Why? Because for almost every, taboo or norm in a culture, you end up wanting to know what is the rationale behind this thing. And of course, it's a very good question to ask. It's good to ask, well, why does this exist? But the thing is, there are some norms that if you ask that, you will end up, it's like Pandora's box. Like, why not open it? Because everything is the answer. There's too much to say. If I told you some reasons, it would demean the reason why you don't do it. And that's sort of how it is, I think, with the fruit. And so it really does come down, the most important things in life, the most important thing that you could tell your son about something, hey, do it this way. And then he says, why? If once you give reasons, that reason is less foundational than the relationship of trust that you have with him, where you could just say, don't, and if you don't have that relationship of trust, then of course you have to lean on rationales or you lean on power, I guess, is the way the world tends to do it, because we're not even patient enough for rationale. But you can see how obviously a civilization that's built that way is quite fragile, that you actually need your families, your very self and your civilizations to be built on something like trust. That when someone says, hey, don't do it this way, that everyone's kind of like, okay, you know better than I. So we'll, in a sense, wait and be patient, because we do want that thing. And it does. And we all agree that that thing is good. But I'm not going to take it the way that I want to take it, because I trust that it doesn't work because you said so. And I don't know how else you would know it. I don't know how else you could know most things that are really important. Unimportant things you can find out pretty quickly on your own. Important things you cannot find out quickly on your own. You find them out by either failing or trusting. And failing is very, not fun.
Well, we talked before the recording of a influential Christian speaker and thinker, Rob Bell, and you were talking about how he found himself on Oprah and became more the spiritual but not religious. And I think this spiritual but not religious dimension is actually avoiding what you're saying of the no of the Father, or the prohibition
that
of
is
the
what
Father.
I'm saying. Yes.
And now there is a tendency, now we're going in a different direction, I think, which is I'm religious but not spiritual, let's say, or this recognition that spirituality necessarily needs to move into religion, that it's not arbitrary. And I think that this movement from spirit to religion is, and maybe it makes sense that Oprah wasn't endorsing the no of the Father, but that we do have to embrace the no of the Father. It's just this basic idea of prohibition, and I do think it's fundamentally related to what you're saying, trust, and it's also fundamentally above particularity of reason. So it's all of that to me is so fundamental. Like a very maybe silly story. I had a girlfriend in my 20s who had a very good relationship with her father, and he had a certain spirit and a certain way about him where all he would need to do is just look at you in a certain way, and that's a prohibition no, right? And everyone just accepts it. But that is won through, of course, trust, I'm assuming, and the relationships that he'd been cultivating throughout his life. And that was sort of the foundation for the family home. But I think that's in part what we're trying to reprocess and reestablish, is just that. And it's above reason, and it's above a kind of spiritual individuality. And it's kind of related to where are the limits, where are the boundaries, where are the borders. And maybe I could just throw it back to you by connecting it to what you're emphasizing of, let's say, the dialectics of inclusion and holiness, that it's more the holiness side of things.
Yes, totally. Yeah, it's beautiful the way you just put it. I was thinking, just back to your talking about being a 20-something and wanting the fruit that somebody else has. In a sense, what you're doing is you're The crazy thing about life is that you can have the fruit that somebody else has, but you can't have the roots that it took to get that fruit nearly as easily. And again, I think that the image of the garden really works here because, in a sense, God is saying, you only want the fruit that you have the roots for. Because if you imagine there's some kind of like, and this again goes back to my Russian nesting dolls in a sense, it's like you want everything to be integrated. You want there to be continuity to your reality. And so, in a sense, the image of the garden is something like, you can take the fruit. That's the crazy thing, is he doesn't say you can't take the fruit, as in you're unable to. You can take the fruit. But once you do, you have no roots in that place. Like you're literally kicked out of the place where the fruit comes from. So you no longer have a fruit tree. You have the fruit. Good luck with that, because you have no connection to how that fruit came to be, or to the place in which it came to be, the context by which that fruit was made. And so, just to make the internet a boogeyman again for a second, and I don't mean that this only happens there, but you can see how obviously certain forms of social media, they're sort of like fruit machines where it's just showing you like, here's the guy who's like way better at guitar than you in this sense, or here's the guy who's way smarter than you philosophically. And you're like, I want that. And then it actually turns out if you just like obsess over guitar, in like playing that one thing, that you can maybe become like that. I mean, most often people just despair because the amount of comparison happening there is just like, I'll literally just never even pick up a guitar because I can't be as good as that guy. But let's say you do, you can sort of, let's say you could achieve that fruit, but what you don't know by way of the internet is the roots of that person. And they're one of two things. It's either a lot of internet famous people are a bunch of fruit without roots. So they're just showing off the fruit. And then one day they're like, Charlie Brown Christmas tree is so overloaded by the fruit itself, which is kind of like we're talking about with fame, and it has no roots, that it just like falls over. And nobody notices that either, because nobody is like, pronouncing all of their failures on social media. You just see their success and then you're like, where'd that person go? Or the other thing could be the case, which is you see their success and you don't see that it took them 20 years to be able to do that thing that you are now watching. Because either way, the internet is not built for roots. It's built for fruit. And so it's sort of like a constant, serpent-like temptation about like, that fruit is good. Like look at it, just take it. Like, you'll see, and anyway, you can go very far with that, but I think the voice of God is something like, the fruit is good. This is the thing that people, mistake about Christianity, is they think it's all this Puritanism, like, no, never take the fruit. It's not like that. It's like Christians, like we really think that sex, for example, is good. We just think that it's so good that it has to be entered into with the right roots, with the right continuity, where it requires a kind of patience of you that is almost painful, that seems almost against your own. It's certainly against your desires, but almost against your own humanity, you might say, in a certain moment, to go at the pace that sex seems to want to go in a religious context. But when you do, there's a rootedness to that relationship that you find like, oh my gosh, sex was never even just fruit. It was like a tree. It actually produces itself. You can go on and on with it, but it's so much more than I thought it was. And if I had just taken it, not only would it have not been what I thought it would have been like painful. It would have been detrimentally not what I thought it was, because now I just have this fruit without the connectedness. So,
well, I'm going to tell a weird story, which is that I think my journey from my hometown, I grew up in a, say, working class family in a working class town, and I had the idea that I need to get out of this working class context and educate myself. And I was the first person in my family to go to university. And basically that entire process was an unrooting of myself. And I was unrooting of myself to get a fruit. And I was patient. I was working. I was
hardworking.
I didn't want the fruit without work. Like I wanted to work for the fruit, but in the process, and also, this should be said about whatever the future of the university needs to be. The way the university is now, it fundamentally unroots people. And the people who
absolutely.
I had tenured professors, the people who I knew who were tenured professors, they, without exception, were all very far away from their home. And they were very far away from any family. So they become very isolated, and they become just only that. They become only the tenured professor because they don't have a network. Because they don't have their family system around them. They are unrooted, even if you think they have the fruit. So in that in that process, um, I think you can get so overwhelmed by the fruit, and you have such a low foundation that you can be destroyed by that entire process. So I just want to say that now where I find myself is this weird reversal where I'm trying to reroot myself, but that whole process of unrooting yourself and rerooting yourself also, I think, has a wisdom or an insight, or there can be a beauty
Absolutely.
in that, because in some way, if you've never been unrooted, you almost don't know what you have in a way. So there, I don't know, there's something there where I guess I'm thinking also about the conversation that we had preparing for the first Christianity in Transition about and Reconstruction, and that there's something constitutive about and Reconstruction, maybe internal to Christianity, where I know there are a lot of people who go through, and I've been talking to a lot of these people, and I see this more now doing the Christian atheism course, of people who were, say, for example, raised evangelical, then they deconstructed out of evangelicalism, and then they somehow through their journey they come back to it but in a new way, and they again see so there's something about that. I'm not sure if you have your own perspective on that, but just this, maybe the value or the wisdom or the insight that can be drawn from derooting or unrooting and then rerooting, and what's gained in that, or what are the hurdles or challenges.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that you're right, that is central to Christianity, because I mean, part of the trouble with, let's say we wanted to just make a philosophy of rootedness or something like that, it wouldn't be a Christian philosophy, in the sense that the ground is toxic. You know, you can't just like grow well where you are. Nobody can, because I mean, at least according to Christian tradition, like everything's messed up. Like you can't, it's not just like, good luck, grow hard. It doesn't work that way. And so there has to be a kind of derootedness and unrootedness. There has to be a death and resurrection is really the symbolism.
And I see that in the people that I grew up around who never left.
Right. Is you end up kind of counting on like the first, what St. Paul would call like the first Adam, rather than the new creation. You never get to experience how God meant for things to be, because you're stuck trying to just make them work as they are. And I do think that the new creation still has its roots in the original creation. This is something that I write about, particularly for evangelicals, because sometimes there's an evangelical way of talking about things that is so kind of victorious in its approach that they would just say, once you're saved, everything is new. And then you're sort of like, well, not everything is new. I'm still living in the same body. I still have the same earthly father and the same earthly mother, and I still did live in the same town, even if I move. For me, there's still continuity between the old and the new, but there is also a discontinuity, a very shocking, you might say, discontinuity, which is why Jesus ends up saying, you must be born again. If you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must be born again. And so with my relationship with deconstruction, let's say, as a word, as a term, is that I'm sort of two minds about it. If I think at first what deconstruction meant was not what I mean by death and resurrection. I think it meant you can learn something better by taking it apart. And I think that that's usually not as true as you think. It is, of course, true for like a car. You can take the car apart and you can learn a lot by taking the car apart. The trouble is that it's way harder to put something back together if you don't actually know what it's for and what it is. If you don't know it in its wholeness, and you don't believe in the function of that wholeness, let's say, like if you don't already love a car for what it does, then you're sort of the wrong person to take it apart, because you'll never have enough love to do the harder work of putting it back together. Anybody can take something apart. Not anybody can put something back together, especially put it back together better than you did before, which is usually why someone would take something apart, is either to learn what it was made of because you love so much what it was made of, or to improve on what it is, usually too, because you love it enough to improve on it. But there is a form of deconstruction that neither loves it enough to want to learn what it is, nor loves it enough to be able to improve upon it. And so they take it apart, thinking that just looking at the parts will give them some kind of new glimpse of what it was. And the crazy thing is, because of the way phenomenological like reality works, is that it will show you like, oh, this wasn't a car. This was just a bunch of parts. I thought this was a car. You'll end up like with an entirely new narrative about what that thing was, because now you're just looking at parts. So, sorry to not be metaphorical about it, I guess you could say with a church, if I began to take apart my childhood in the church, and I began to sort of like put under the microscope this, 50-year-old man that was teaching me Sunday school, and then I say, oh, he did that to that person, like this whole thing was a lie. Like, I can't believe that he was dishonest in this particular business. He even went to jail for a year for tax evasion or whatever. And he was teaching me the Bible. I mean, come on, this whole thing, you could do that with almost every person in my church. You could do that even with probably if I had some microphone to record the words that they said when they were telling me a certain story, especially now as somewhat of a theologian, I could be like, what was this? Like, what was this trash that they were teaching me? But by doing it that way, let's say that all my past in the church was recorded and I could go back and deconstruct it in that sense, I wouldn't actually be seeing what I thought I was seeing. I'd be seeing the recorded moments, but I wouldn't be seeing them in the way that I experienced them then, which actually made me who I am today. Right. And of course you can do this. Always happens with our parents. You grow up and you figure out, oh, your parents are not like these like all wise beings. They're like just as terribly sinful as you are and just as unwise, or maybe even more so. But to deconstruct your parents that way doesn't change the fact that they're the reason that you exist. They're the reason you're alive. And they're the reason that you're healthy enough to even be able to have thoughts like that in the first place, where you could deconstruct their motherhood and their fatherhood or whatever. And so that's the form that I take issue with, I guess. But of course, there is another form, like you said, which is to have to unroot yourself, which everyone does to some degree, from something in order to reroot yourself more healthily. But again, I think you have to love the thing in order to do that. So, or else you hate the thing and you're just trying to do something else totally different. But that's not deconstruction. That's just deconversion. And there's plenty of that going around too, which is just like, here's how I hate Christianity, and I'm moving on to Buddhism or to some other progressive philosophy or whatever. That also exists. But I would
even people who are in that, even people who I've met who are in that phase, I do think they usually come back.
Right.
Like,
well, it's hard to escape
Christianity. They explore maybe Eastern spirituality, and then I think usually what I've seen, there is a motion of return, and I think it has to do with, in part, that it's harder to escape the way we were raised or the culture we were raised in or the forms that we were raised in than we think. And so, like, if you were raised in a certain structure, you might need to unroot from it due to certain experiences or certain failures or certain troubles. And the chance that you might come back to it in a new way is in my experience and listening to people's stories, high. But I wanted to say,
or else it'll be a ghost that haunts you.
Oh yeah, it will haunt you. Yeah, it could haunt you, right?
Sorry, go on.
In my own way, probably I could say the same thing about fatherhood. That I think that in many ways now I'm going to be encountering that return to the importance of fatherhood, because I'm going to be becoming a father this year, and I could easily see myself having walked a different path and then ended up haunted by fatherhood for the rest of my life or something like that. So that really can happen. But I wanted to say, in regards to the work at Philosophy Portal, that really it's synergistic with what we're saying about the way you were talking about how easy it is to deconstruct and how hard it is to reconstruct, which is that the foundation of Philosophy Portal has been to learn the foundations of modern philosophy and discourse. And the reason why is because I think we have grown up in an age of deconstructive philosophy. And the challenge of that is not that deconstructive philosophy is wrong. It's that if kids are only being raised on deconstructive philosophy, then they don't know what they're deconstructing.
Exactly.
That's like, for example, the best example I give is that Foucault is usually seen as one of the agents of deconstruction, but Foucault was philosophically raised on Hegel and Heidegger and Husserl.
Yes.
He read those.
Yes.
He read those texts. So
Great
he
example.
wasn't deconstructing without knowing those texts. But now
Yes.
you'll have people who just read Foucault, and then they don't know the text that inspired Foucault. So that's a big problem. Like, I was even I found myself talking to the head of the NHS, funny enough, one day, and she was talking about the National Health Services in Britain. And she was talking about how students come in today and they are deconstructing methods without even knowing what the methods are or having actually used the methods that they're so. But
Yes.
it's a huge structural problem, and I think
This is
that
like contemporary art, right? Like where you,
yeah,
there
yeah,
was, let's say, pointillism or something like the Impressionism, which was basically like they learned every single skill that came before that, and then they were like, "Wait, no, we're gonna deconstruct that and do something completely different than you've ever seen before."
yeah.
But then at some point, it's just only the deconstruction, and there's no actual appreciation for the tradition of all the
Like for
brushstrokes that came
example, if
before.
you study the history of Picasso's work, he knew how to do classical
Yeah,
painting.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
he was well trained in all of the classical methods before he was
Yes.
experimenting with all the crazy things he ended up experimenting with cubism and things like that. So
Right. Right.
so I was thinking about also the metaphor of I was thinking about this. Why I've been thinking about this in regards to Christianity is, and the reason I'm saying this is because I think it's related to the ideas and the forms that I think about Plato, and I also think about Christianity using the metaphor of a black hole. That the perfect forms or the perfect ideas would be the black hole, and in many ways they don't exist in, or
Mm-hmm.
they don't exist in the way that space-time exists, because in
Mm-hmm.
the center of the black hole space-time breaks down, geometry breaks down,
Yes.
and you just have a singularity which is mathematically impossible to describe, and we don't know what happens at the singularity. Is another universe being born, or is it a portal to
Yep.
another dimension or something like that? But in a way, I think Plato and Christianity stumble upon. It's almost like before Plato and Christianity, we just, in the, say, the pagan universe, we just know space time.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's like Plato and Christianity stumble upon a black hole in space time. Like, oh, guys, there's a black hole here. And then, and then what, say, Platonists or Christians do is they say, well, that's the way. And then they say, well, we have to orbit basically this density. We have to orbit this rupture in normal fabric of space-time. But I was just thinking about, like, on that orbit or on that way, on that path, you could easily have mistakes, failures, ruptures that you don't orbit perfectly.
Yes.
And then the mistake people make is, oh, because there was a mistake on my path, that the whole thing
Right.
is wrong. So I think just that metaphor
Well
is
said.
quite helpful, at least for me in organizing the way I think about that.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, imagine I always use that exact same orbiting frame to talk about addiction. So imagine the alcoholic. In a sense, it's like, why do addictions exist in the first place? It's because we are orbiting beings. It doesn't mean that we're meant to just get hooked on, the thing that's the worst for us, but it does mean that we're meant to be hooked in a sense, that we're meant to be centered. And then if you have a center, it doesn't mean you stay. It's dynamic. You move, and orbits have all kinds of, cool functions. And, it's why we are alive and we exist, I guess, is because we're orbiting healthily around the sun. But you could imagine, to kind of stay with your example, if you, as an alcoholic, you haven't drank in 6 years, and then you just have one rager of a night, how devastating that is to you. But if you could zoom out, you just see, like, no, dude, you're totally fine. You had one bad night. But I mean, people's entire lives are changed by one moment of being off orbit or feeling off orbit, even though in a sense you're not off orbit. Your orbit, like, the thing that more defines your orbit is you haven't had a drink in 6 years. One, 4-hour thing that you did isn't even a blip on that radar. But for us, the way that we experience it is so strong that it can just make you think, like, screw it, I don't even want this whole orbit anymore, or maybe I was never on it. Is sometimes what people begin to think.
So, like,
So
what's the different, like, because I feel like this is important for being able to love. I don't know if you know the John Delaney or John Deloney show. He's a YouTuber who helps people with.
no,
He's just a YouTuber who people call in, and I like listening to it because people just call in with their family troubles. They call in whatever's really
okay,
bothering them. And one
yep,
woman was calling in and saying, like, should I divorce my husband because he had a coke addiction, and then he wasn't doing and I like it because they just go deep into, like, these really tough issues, right? Like, my
yeah,
husband
yeah,
has a coke addiction, right? And then she was saying, like, I don't know if I should divorce him because I saw he brought Coke into the house, and it's been years since he's done that. But it's kind of like that, right? Like that's where the moment. It's hard to know the difference between loving someone in that blip where they either got off the wagon, they had a bad night, and they hadn't drank in 6 years, but then they got really drunk, and someone who's kind of committed to the binging, like, or committed
Oh
to,
yeah.
like, you know what I mean? So how,
Oh,
I
I know
feel
what you
like
mean.
that, that's super hard. I don't want to get too personal with like family
No,
stories with this, but it's very practical for what families sometimes struggle with.
I think this is complex because a lot of times a blip is not a blip. It's just the one time that it shows up on the radar. For example, in my life, I've seen a lot of marriages fail because of unfaithfulness. And almost always, the time that the blip comes onto the screen and it's like, oh, you were just caught in adultery, is not actually, it's not like it was just, oh my gosh, I just made this terrible mistake. It was so random. I can't believe I gave into that. Like my example of the person who has
It's
the
a
one,
deeper pattern.
it's more like it's not like a tornado that just hit your house. It's more like a tree that has been growing up through the floorboards of your house for a very long time. And you have been ignoring it. And maybe even your family has been kind of ignoring it, but it's been there and everyone's kind of like circumnavigating this thing that's growing up through your house. And then your house breaks in half, when this final news comes out. And so there's that kind of, blip, which is not a blip, I guess I would say. And there are forms of, let's say, codependency within marriage that can allow something like that to happen. Usually, obviously, there's no sense in blaming the person who didn't do the thing. It's usually the person who did do the thing that's to blame. But it arises from deeper patterns, deeper orbits, let's say. Oftentimes, almost all the time, what I see in my pastoral work is just pornography that leads to some kind of form of prostitution that leads to some other kind of affair or whatever. And so then it's sort of like, oh my gosh, it's out in the open. I can't believe this is so shocking, and this person was such a good Christian and they were, in their church for however long. But it's like, well, it's not that shocking if, you took any of the other signs to be signs. And so that's part of it, is that I would say we have to notice the trees that are growing through the floorboards so that we can put the axe there before they break the house in half. And those things are subtle, and they are the things that are disintegrating us right now that maybe aren't going to ruin your marriage, and so you keep doing them, or they aren't going to make you an utter drug addict right away, and so you keep doing them. But those trees keep growing and they end up breaking things.
The disposition that I've cultivated in relationship to some of these problems is, I won't give specific examples, but just sort of the form that I've cultivated is basically when I was basically it's trying to get out of the position of being too judgmental, like where basically the form is I'm perfect and you're flawed, and the flaw you're doing should be measured against my perfection, versus we're both flawed, and in some ways we both struggle with this problem, maybe in different ways, but we're both struggling in our own way. And then that creates a window, or that creates a place to potentially meet. And it also creates a place where the other person doesn't feel like they're lower than or less than or somehow being judged by, because none of us are in the position of whatever the position of God, basically.
That's right. Let he who has not sinned cast the first stone. We are all ones that have no right to cast the stone, and therefore finding some kind of mutuality and reciprocity within a relationship like that, a brokenness, is, I think, exactly the right way. It's weird because I think you kind of like you brought up holiness and inclusion. There's a sense in which that's the inclusive part of the paradigm, where you're like, look, I'm the same as you are in this, but I think there can be another aspect that you oftentimes need to add to it, which is, but let me also be like an authoritative voice for you in this. Like if we can agree that we're on the same page in some sense, but your struggle is slightly different than mine, then let me also sort of help to raise you up in a sense. And so I know it sounds weird to say that because it sounds condescending, but I think there is in every human a kind of need for friendship, but also a need for leadership or fatherhood or something like that. And fatherhood's not the same as friend. Like you wouldn't become a good father simply by always saying to your child, "Hey, I'm just like you." You know, there is a sense in which that relationship has to happen.
We do need teachers, we do need authorities, we do need masters in a sense, and that's we do need that.
And sometimes you can be the same to the same person, right? You can be both a friend or even a son to someone to whom you're also a friend and a father, but in different ways. Where one of my best friends, we have that kind of relationship where we're very different, our struggles are very different, and we trust each other so much that I can kind of give him a hard time about something, and he can give me a hard time about something that are not the thing that the other person struggles with, but it doesn't feel hypocritical, it doesn't feel condescending, because we know we're both sinners, but we don't struggle with the same things, and so we care enough about each other to not only have the kind of pleasant relationship where you don't bring up hard things. It's like, hey, don't talk about your wife that way, even when you're not with her, or something like that. You can say that to certain people, not to very many people, because they just get pissed at you right away. But you can say it to some if you have that trust.
Well, maybe shifting focus a little bit, but I wanted to bring this up, is again, this concept that we were playing around with in the portal, and wanted to know how it connects with the way you think about things, is the concept of the metagelical. How do you think about that concept? And have you been following some of the threads that have been going on in the TLC about how that concept is being developed, and how does that help you or not help you make sense of your own relationship to Christianity?
Okay, so I have to be honest in that I haven't been following it very well. So you can help inform me, but I'm aware of it enough that I know it's kind of been Paul Vanderklay's word, and people are beginning to use it more. And I think I understand what he means by it. And I think that the TLC is a metagelical space as far as I understand it. The thing that maybe would relate it to what we've been talking about already that I'll say, and then you can bring me down some other trail if need be, is that I'm encouraged by this metagelical move in that I think it is the end. It's my understanding of the end of Protestantism is, and I don't mean end as in finished, but I mean end as in like the telos of Protestantism is in a sense a reintegration with the church. So if I understood myself to still be protesting, I would be somewhat disappointed with that tradition. If it takes 500 years to protest something and we're still in need of protesting that thing, either we didn't do a very good job protesting it, or maybe people aren't listening to us for a reason. And so I don't love even calling myself a Protestant for that reason, because the term itself, though I certainly am one, I'm from that tradition, and I'm glad that I am. The term itself I don't relate with as sitting in the seat of protest, let's say. I understand what it was protesting and why, and I'm glad that it did. And I think it even was quite effective in reforming the Catholic Church pretty quickly, that there ended up being a reformation, not only that split off from the Catholic Church, but also a reformation within the Catholic Church that soon followed. And so I think it was effective in what it did. But Luther and Calvin, especially Luther, I can speak to, was not trying to start his own church at the time. He was trying to reform the church that he loved, the church that he was a part of. And whether it was the church itself that was to blame, or maybe his ridiculous tactics at certain points that caused him to be so excommunicated as to start an entirely new branch of Christianity, the different sides will argue as to which one of those is true. I think it's easy to say they're both true. It was both his fault and their fault. That is sad in the sense that we don't want to be some splintered and continuing to splinter church. The image I think I used with the portal when we were talking together is, if the center is something like fatherhood and motherhood, like belonging, your place of deepest belonging, and then something goes wrong in the center, like something goes wrong in the household, then the only way to have any health, in a sense, is to get out of the household at first, because you're not in charge. You're just kind of like subject to this terrible motherhood, fatherhood thing. Fatherhood is maybe the better example, because I'm talking about institutions here to some degree, and fatherhood seems to be the better symbol for that. And so you have to get out. But then, kind of like I was talking about in the portal, to be outside and to hear, like so much of the Bible says, that God loves the margin. He loves the outsider. He's there for the outsider, is all true. But it's still also true that we were not meant to not have a home. We were not meant to just be like sort of homeless wanderers who can be blessed in our homelessness. We were meant to have some blessing that allows us to go back home. And this gets back to your like unrooting in order to be rooted or whatever. And so that's my whole understanding of the Protestant telos, hopefully, is that in a sense we would have to be unrooted from something because there was such a terrible disagreement or discontinuity within the church itself that all you could do is leave the church in a sense, even though you don't even want to. Luther says, I don't even want to leave, but they're kicking me out, basically. But then you'd have to remember that it isn't like, oh, well, it's fine. Like God loves all the splintered fraction, homeless churches and people out there. Yes, he does. But that's not a telos. The telos is to make a home again. It's to become and to redeem fatherhood. Because you can't live without fatherhood and motherhood and homes. And so that would be my maybe 30,000-foot view of why I'm encouraged by a kind of metagelical approach, which is to say a hallway, let's say online, that is allowing for discourse between the Orthodox and Catholics and different kind of Protestant, even more progressive Protestants, but also really traditional Calvinist, PVK, Paul Vanderklay, is like the most traditional Protestant, right? He comes from the Calvinist tradition. He himself is super open, which is awesome. It's why he's a good founder of that. But his tradition is like, Calvinism. It's like the Puritans. And so to be able to mix that with, Jonathan Pageau, who's from Eastern Orthodox faith, or Vervaeke, who's not even a Christian, or Jordan Peterson, who's not exactly a Christian, is very cool to me. And I think it can bring a new unity through that kind of uprootedness and new rootedness that comes from that. So that's my take.
There's a lot to say, but I just want to say that, in the context of how you're speaking about metagelicalism, that's also how I understand it, that the metagelical turn is basically a new boundary or a new set of borders or coordinates for processing the Christian conversation, which is
Correct.
Not to say Protestants internal to Protestantism discussing their differences, or Catholics internal to Catholicism discussing their differences, or Orthodox, but that this is kind of a conversation that's trying to bring all the Christian forms into a new conversation. And that is sort of the label of metagelical. But I think it's why I think it's such an important concept is because I have seen people who, let's say, deconstructed or are taking a distance from the way you were describing the history of Protestantism and protest culture and stuff like that, taking a distance from Protestantism and critiquing and deconstructing Protestantism, and then say, I want to go back to Catholicism or Orthodoxy. But in some sense, what that move is missing is the fact that there was also truth in the splits. There was also truth in the history. So we can't just go back to like a non-historical or think that, those splits were a mistake. We have to somehow take up in a new way the history of Christianity as a whole. That's how I'm understanding it. And that doesn't also mean that we're just wanderers. It just means that there's a rerouting of a home that is taking up the entire history as the truth.
Exactly.
Instead of going back to like a non-historical truth or something like that. And I think that I've seen that also in just to bring this back to like a fractal level analysis, maybe, is that, and even in an atheist or a secular way of analysis, is that I've also seen the truth in the history of my family, that if you have problems in the family home, sometimes it's best to get away from the family to heal before you can root a new family.
Sometimes the only way.
And sometimes the only way. And I've have cousins who are in that situation as well. Or in my history with the university, I think that I've developed a new health by leaving the university.
Yes.
Even though I love the university. So there's that dimension. Sometimes the best is to take a distance in order to recultivate that health. And maybe that's part of what's going on and part of what Christianity is trying to reprocess in this transition that's being called metagelical. And I want to sort of state that what I'm tracking, or what I'm trying to track now, is the relationship between the metagelical and the exvangelical. Because I think there's a huge conversation there and a huge opportunity for. At Wake Festival, I just got back from Wake Festival, which is Peter Rollins' event. And the conversation that I was trying to generate is the idea of an impossible bridge. To build an impossible bridge between the metagelicals and the exvangelicals. To give an example, some of the people who go to Peter Rollins' Wake Festival were raised in evangelicalism or are still in evangelicalism, but they have an outsider position.
Yes.
In relationship to it. And that's kind of where I'm so interested in what the conversations would be between the people on the quote unquote inside and people quote unquote on the outside. Maybe those aren't the right words. Maybe we need different words. But for example, I really connected at Wake Festival with a pastor who works at a progressive church. For example, doesn't necessarily matter this, but he's in an interracial marriage with mixed kids, but outside the church, there's LGBTQ plus flags. And like, there's the weird thing, there's that, the LGBTQ plus flag with all the different stripes and the triangle.
Yes.
And then there's the cross in it. Like, they put a cross.
Oh, I haven't seen that. Yeah.
So, but to me, that's like such an interesting symbolism. It's
really interesting symbolism. I have to think about that for a while.
What would be the conversation there between Jonathan Pajot and someone who works at that church, right? I would be definitely tuning in.
Totally. Yeah, that's really
There's
interesting.
a lot there, but I'm basically trying to say, and so the Hegelian language that I would use is sublation. And sublation is basically a canceling and a lifting. So the truth would be, say, for example, Luther is canceling the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
But then the sublation would either be the truth of the split in Protestantism or the truth internal to Catholicism where they reform themselves, where they accept the canceling, but then they lift higher to another. And then, so like the metagelical would be, there's all these negations internal to Christian denominations, but then we lift the whole history to a new truth. And I think that's to me how I would make sense of what's going on, or the stakes for even the conversations we're having and could have.
Yeah, that's very similar to how I understand the symbolism of death and resurrection. The way you're talking about sublation is something like a born againness. It's sort of like something must die in order for something else to be born. That is, in a sense, a resurrection of something old, but in a new way, because something has been sacrificed in the process. So that tracks. But then you have to sort of be careful to see that, let's say both, there's a really deep paradox in it, both that the death is a true death, that you really aren't just secretly holding on to something, but wanting to improve it, because the improvement sometimes only comes in the thing dying. And also that there is real continuity between the death and the resurrection. So I talked about this a little bit on the portal, but the crazy thing that Christians believe is that it's like our bodies that will be raised from the dead. So it isn't this like weird, like, oh no, there's just going to be a totally new body that's made of some totally new, let's say, person. Yes, it is a new body, but it is made of you. It is your body raised from the dead. And so that confluence, that seemingly contradictory confluence of full death and yet continuity between death and resurrection is, I think, how you can tell true things, I think, in a way. I think it's almost like a way to test almost everything.
The problem is I think that what I see is, on one side, there's maybe a group of people who I would say want the resurrection without the crucifixion or without the death.
That's what I'm getting at.
Even if intellectually they know it's both, they want to maybe put the crucifixion or the death in the past, like we already went through that, we don't need that anymore, and now we're just in the resurrection mode, and now we're... And then the other way, you could also do it the other way, where you just fetishize the death, and you just fetishize the lack, or you just fetishize the crucifixion, and then you don't want actually the resurrection, or you don't, and that can also become something that you want to avoid. And so can go both ways,
Oh
but
yeah, that's a full avoidance. It's a full avoidance of life and of
yeah,
continuity in the sense that you actually have to live for something. You can't
yeah.
just kind of like live in, uh, let's say, the cancellation of something, which again would be something like hyper Protestantism, where you're just like constantly living in the protest of something. But you can see how that kind of Protestantism has been pretty definitive of our culture on any number of levels. I mean, even just what protest culture is, in a sense, is it gave rise to, it became a plausibility structure for saying no being kind of like a way of life. Like I say no to this, and that is sort of like my way, as opposed to needing to find a way after you've said no, needing to find what arises on the other side.
It's
And
back
everybody
to the
struggles with that.
fruit. It's back to the fruit metaphor of the
Yeah.
prohibition of the father, and that yes, we have to include within our societies the prohibition, the no of the father, but it is, as you were saying in the story, it is because the father wants you to have the fruit eventually, just in the right
Yes.
time and in the right way. So it's not, so it's the dichotomy between, it's like the ethics of the fruit and the mediation of the fruit.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well said. Um, yeah. So with ex-evangelicals, I you know, different people mean all different things by that. I guess my concern with that sort of label is that it would seem to be protesting too much, I guess, like that it would be a kind of movement that knows what it isn't, um, but not necessarily what it is. And of course, everybody has to go through those movements, but it's a liminal period. You wouldn't necessarily want to stay there. It'd be like leaving the house because you know it's broken. And then I'm like, I get it. Like I get it. I know why my friends are ex-evangelicals, because they were a part of broken houses, you know, and I don't just mean their household. Sometimes it was their household, but it was also their church oftentimes. But I also hurt for them because I want them to believe in belonging still. I want them to believe in fatherhood still. I want them to believe in the church still. And so obviously, you know, ex-evangelicals can make their own churches. I want to be careful here because I know a lot of, you know, the people you're just spending a ton of time with are ex-evangelicals, but I guess you can just know that, hopefully you can know that I'm saying this in good faith. I fear that for at least a lot of the people that I'm close to and the movements that I've seen and the churches that I've seen that have come out of that movement, the churches themselves don't look like gatherings that are for something so much as gatherings that are escaping something. And I would say maybe if they're the thing that they might be most for is like progressive sexuality, because a lot of this comes down to a kind of progressive politics and progressive sexuality. And that I get, because Lord knows it is extremely hard to deal with marginalized sexuality. Like it's not easy to deal with. And in the portal, I talked about a center and a margin. And, you know, I don't think that Christianity has ever been a kind of eradicating faith about these sorts of things. Like, no, all the sexual sinners are out, you know, because then everyone would be out. Everybody knows that. That's always been the Christian doctrine, is like everybody's sexually broken. Everybody's broken. But it is a kind of center and margin where certain forms of sexuality cannot be made to be central. And so I guess what I see in a lot of my ex-evangelical sort of friends is that they don't accept that sort of center and margin way of thinking about things. And so they centralize marginalized sexuality, especially in a kind of marginalized politics. And I understand why, and I feel deep compassion for it. But my concern is that isn't a home. It's basically just like making the margin into a center, which is to say making the margin everything.
I think that's a good place to have conversations. And I'm also sort of in agreement with you on a deep level about the way in which the center and margin can be confused. I wanted to bring this up earlier, but I mean, I'm a weird kind of leftist. But I'm just paying attention to leftist media. And for example, listening to this one YouTube channel this week, which is more left in orientation. And I've been studying the way they talk about marriage,
Mm-hmm.
not even as a central topic, but just that it will come up or it will be a part of the conversation somehow. And the way they talk about marriage is like it's some demonic or something evil or something boring or something like that. It's horrible that marriage is like, or at like, in the best case scenario, marriage is kind of like bland and boring.
Yeah, boring. Yeah, I thought that's what you were going to say, but you're right. There is also the like actually demonizing of marriage. But yes,
and there is also
either boring or
But I think what is so confused there, and there's also some theorists that I've been working with who are trying to change this narrative. But basically, it's coming from the 1960s and the counterculture in the 1960s, where somehow marriage and the family is seen as the antithesis of freedom.
Right.
Seen as somehow opposed to freedom, rather than a very pathway to freedom. So
yes,
I think
exactly.
that one of the key things that I'm trying to think through is how we can reframe marriage and how we can reframe family as actually a key to freedom, and actually that it provides a haven in a heartless world, a safety from even market dynamics, that in the family you can get a protection from market dynamics. And that actually, paradoxically, it could be that some leftists are shooting themselves in the foot by making an enemy of the family and marriage, because it exposes them more to market dynamics that they hate so much. So this is something that it's hard to talk about, but I do think that's one of the things. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm motivated to have this conversation between, and people don't maybe even self-identify as metagelical or exvangelical, but just those types of community conversations, the type of community conversations that I would label as metagelical or exvangelical, to have those impossible conversations about the pastor at the progressive church, which is centering maybe marginalized sexuality. And that's also important to bring into the picture, because you were saying that your church had major complications with sexuality and sexual trauma. Totally. That it can go, so that somehow both of these positions need each other, and that creating the spaces where those impossible conversations could happen could create something new, something that somehow allows us to reframe a lot of the culture war tensions in a more potentially creative or productive way.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I've said something that I'm concerned about with let's say the exvangelical or which is usually tends to be a more progressive approach to the church and to sexuality. But
yeah, exactly.
The reason that I understand that is, and so this would be to say something that I'm concerned about on the other side, is that, and this is why I wrote the Parish Manifesto, it kind of brings it full circle in a sense to the kind of parish lifestyle that I'm talking about, is that once your churches become kind of like a bunch of individual consumers consuming something that are part of the global economy, I guess you'd say, like even when your church kind of feels like a form of globalism, where that you could go to a very similar church like in France or Japan or something like that, and it would have kind of, obviously there could be a good reason for that because we're rooted in the same tradition, but there could also be kind of like a consumeristic reason for that even your church is beginning to basically just serve individual consumers what they need. And then your marriage and your family is kind of like, good, go get married. That's good. But it doesn't become central to the sort of family of the church, because the church almost is more like the marketplace than it is like the household in this sort of modern evangelical scheme that I'm talking about. And so for me, I think that really becomes a problem when you're then talking about the sexually marginalized people who find themselves as complete weirdos in a sort of conservative Christian context, or even just any sort of traditional context where it's like, yeah, like we celebrate people having families and having kids. In the 80s, it was a guy named James Dobson who had Focus on the Family, was a big movement that it ended up giving some fuel to the moral majority, the religious right, all of that sort of stuff. But it was mainly, he was basically just saying, focus on the nuclear family in ways that are similar to what you're saying, which is funny, like from the left, but he's saying this from the right, like we need to kind of overcome the sexual revolution and just remember that families are most important. But the thing that backfired about that was that we didn't actually have institutions that could then you need more than a nuclear family. You need a village. And so if your church is basically just a bunch of nuclear families pasted together, if you're the minority because you're a widow, or because you are somehow single, or because you're single for a reason, because you don't fit into the sexual norms in a way that you can't figure out, or you don't know, or whatever, you just fall through the cracks immediately, because all this is a bunch of kind of really just nuclear families pasted together. And so to me, it comes back to trying to build continuity within a sort of village context where you can have integration of all kinds of minority views and practices without having to make them central. Because they are just, I mean, certain things are, yeah, I mean, I think that's what I want to say about that. So.
Well, with the nuclear families being pasted together thing, I'm just making sense of that in regards to maybe this is like sort of part where the complex system science angle comes into things, and the parts and the whole, where you actually, the ideal would be is if you're bringing all these nuclear families together and you get something that's qualitatively different than just the nuclear families pasted together. There's a qualitative change.
Yeah, you have motherhood and fatherhood for a community, not just motherhood and fatherhood for a house.
It is like, if you're doing it right, that would be a naturally emergent phenomenon. Something qualitatively different would naturally produce itself.
Yes. That's what I'm proposing. And of course that does exist. Like I'm in churches right now where that does exist, and where I'm seeing, I mean, my church here is radically multi-ethnic. I say radically in the sense that it was founded on that principle, basically, like we're going to be down to all the staff, to, you know, many of the marriages, to the leadership of the church, and even the lay leadership of the church is very carefully representative of the different ethnic communities of our area. And the fruit of that has been that people do not fall through the cracks in ways that they might in a more homogenous or less, in a community that was less sensitive to that sort of problem. But that also creates its own difficulties that you wouldn't have if you weren't. It does create some pasting together, to be honest. It's not all emergence. It's not all synergy. Sometimes you feel like, man, we're trying real hard for this, but we're not actually doing it, because most of the Black people that I'm worshiping next to every week live in a different neighborhood than most of the white people who actually happen to live in my neighborhood, you know? And so it's like, I'm glad we're worshiping together, but man, it's hard work to do that integration. And you imagine that it's that hard with race, with which we've made greater strides and had longer to do in America than something like the sexual war, for lack of a better word, which is newer for us and is going to take much longer. So
I think that just the important point there that I want to stress for the complexity science angle is that I think that and I think this is related to what we were talking about earlier with people who just want resurrection without death, or crucifixion, or people who just want the death, crucifixion without the resurrection, that it's both. That sometimes this can manifest in the complexity science discourse, where people they understand sort of the dynamics of the parts and the wholes, and that if you synergize the parts in the right way, you'll get something qualitatively different. That doesn't mean that you can avoid all of the friction and the tension that's required to put the pieces together in the right way. And in some sense, that process of putting the pieces together in the right way is a never-ending process. Like it's not just that you put the pieces together and then you get the emergence and then it's just all fine. And that's
what gives you roots.
But that's how it actually works on all levels, because, like, for example, the cells in my body are interacting in the right way to produce the whole body that is my body. But at any moment in my life, a certain area or a certain organization of my cells could undergo apoptosis, and all of a sudden I have cancer. Right? So, and then my whole body's integrity is potentially at a threat. So that's always, and so I'm just saying that metaphor because that's always potential of the church. Right? Like the church could always potentially have a certain cancerous body and could undergo a certain degradation or collapse in on itself.
Yes, absolutely. It's the danger of even having a center. Like like a human body or a circulatory system or whatever, if you want to use the human body, it's like the fact that we exist as a unified person makes it very dangerous to have some foreign substance that infects you, because then you as a unified person are now infected in a way that can't be easily amputated. It just is going to kill you, or else it's going to have to be eradicated in some other way. And that's the danger of oneness, the danger of unity. And but it's also beautiful. It's also what makes roots grow, is like the tension and the it makes you less fragile to have to work through the kinds of things that our church has worked through over the last almost 25 years. So it creates a lot of beauty, but it's not like it is all fruit.
What I'm sensing into is another potential alliance between the way you think and the work I've done at Philosophy Portal is that one of the principles that has the foundation of our work is this idea that almost all of modern philosophy and all modern philosophers have kind of had let's say, a fatherly rebellion against Hegel. That, whether it's Kierkegaard or Deleuze or
I always
Nietzsche
just think of Kierkegaard.
or Marx, but they all have. All modern philosophers have had some sort of daddy rebellion against Hegel. But like that's the problem. But that's the problem of the center. Like that, if you have a center, it can also be abused. It can also be totalitarian. It can also be too much. And you also do need the sun, and you do need that rebellion, and you do need that negation, and you do need that deconstruction. So this is something that's an ongoing, somehow to hold, you're using the language center and margin, but that you do need to be able to hold both here, and that there's something really, and usually the weird thing is that in my engagement with modern philosophy, that kind of the recentering of Hegel in modern philosophy has come through Zizek, and Zizek is someone who's very strange. He's even someone who you would see in his performance and the way of his writing is something that's like very weirdly Hegelian. Like I don't make sense of this as textbook Hegelian. So there's a way in which Zizek's bringing back Hegel to the forefront has been done in a very weird performative stance and in the most unlikely and unexpected of ways. And I wonder if this is also relevant to the Metagelical, because people who are inside the evangelical church who might be rebelling against the evangelical church, say they're ex-evangelicals, they might not be able to recognize the salvaging of the center, and that the metagelical might come back in a weird way. Like, and I would say that if that, in this case, the TLC would be a good example of a weird, like people inside the church might be like, what's the TLC? These weird people online having these weird groups and weird conversations and something. I don't really know how to make sense of this. But somehow it might be bringing it back to some sort of reconstructive turn.
Oh, totally. I love that image. It's really cool to think about Hegel that way. I have to think on that more. And I've just started to listen to more of Zizek. So now I'll think about that in that regard too. But yeah, I think you're right about the church. I mean, I really think this is the reality of, like, I think that kind of death and resurrection or restoration is the way that reality is made. Like you're saying, it's even the way that biology works. It's the way that the human body works. It's a kind of death to make room for a newer and restored version of the thing that was dying, that needed to die in order for the new thing to come into its place. But like I said, with continuity between the old and the new, because if you said that first part without the second part, then it would just be like endless revolution, just replacing everything. No respect for Hegel, let's say, or whatever.
Exactly.
But and then you would lose everything.
That's I think what happened to philosophy.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
yeah. I mean,
and I'm coming at, and even with philosophy, I'm coming at it kind of from the outside, because I studied anthropology and science, and then I came into philosophy kind of like more as an autodidact, and that's kind of how I read it.
Yeah, the same with me with theology, which is what I pay more attention to. Is theology tends to be, and similar to philosophy, it tends to be if you try to put it on a timeline, the pendulum swing of well, we went a little too far on this side, so now we're going to go a little too far on this side, which Hegel does a good job dealing with. even with some of the theology there. But you can hopefully see, if you take a step back from that, you can begin to see like, okay, there is a marriage of opposites that needs to occur without the opposites losing their oppositeness. So it's not exactly a golden mean. It is that there really is a seeming contradiction at the center of everything.
Oh, yeah.
And that we exist. So it can't actually be a full-fledged contradiction. It has to be something more like a paradox, where existence itself is brought into existence through this relationship of these opposites, which of course just sounds like biology again, but then it's just like, well, yeah, that's what's going on. It's at every level. So yeah,
marriage is like that, life is like that. Absolutely. Yeah. So maybe
yeah, I agree that the metagelical, I was just going to say, I agree that in some sense what the metagelical is doing is it's dealing with opposites, right? It's taking these like ortho bros and they're talking to like Pentecostals,
exactly,
utter formless spiritual Christianity with like the most fully form, driven Christianity, the oldest and the newest. And then they're just like having conversations with each other. And I think it's awesome. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. Well, Ross, I think in terms of bringing this conversation to a close, is there anything you'd want to say about your project and pointing towards your? I mean, of course, I'll leave the links to Patient Kingdom and any other works that you might want me to leave in the link in the description. But yeah, just pointing towards where people can find you and maybe what's salient for you in your ongoing work.
Thanks. I mean, Patient Kingdom is great. I'm not highly online, and so my work there is the most online version of me. PatientKingdom.com. It's just a Substack account, and I try to write long form essays once or twice a month, and some little things in between. I don't really have any other goals besides that for the near term. So privileged to have great conversations like this one. So thank you for including me in the philosophy portal and in what you're doing. I'm writing a way too long piece that could almost turn into a book right now about forgiveness. So that's kind of where my mind has been at recently. Just you're asking what I've been thinking about. So I don't know if that will be published this week, which was my goal, or if it will just turn into some kind of monster, which often happens with my things. And then I have to table it because I have too much to say and don't know how to say it. So,
well, I listened to your conversation with Paul Vanderklay about writing and thinking. And I know you articulated kind of that you think, that you're basically the struggle of translating really good thinking into really good writing. And how to bridge that.
I love that struggle, but I know that I'm a pretty good thinker, but I'm not a good enough writer yet. And but that makes me, as an artist, like I'm a musician, I've begun to see writing as kind of like the new instrument that I want to play. I mean, it's not that new. I've been writing for years, but that I'm like, I really want to figure this out. And so, warning to anyone who goes to Patient Kingdom, I have not quite figured it out yet, but it's been fun to try.
Well, I think the topic of forgiveness is about as difficult of a topic as you could pick.
It is.
So you really know how to pick the tough ones, but that's probably why we need to think and talk about it. So maybe we'll have another conversation about that at some time.
I love it. Thank you for the privilege of getting to talk with you. I love seeing what you're doing, Cadell. And excited for your family and your future.
Yeah, for anyone who doesn't know, there's a baby on the way. So
fatherhood
is very much theoretically and
announce this to the internet. But yay. Congrats.
Absolutely. All right. Well, it's been Ross Byrd with Cadell Last, and I'll leave links in the description to Ross's blog, and hope to have many more conversations like this. So thanks for the work you brought to Philosophy Portal as well, Ross.
Same to you. Thanks, Cadell.
The Portal is a living, thinking community. Becoming a member of the Portal gives you access to 4 live events every month, but more importantly, an opportunity to learn how to think with others, to learn with online creators and para-academics, and to develop your own capacity as a philosopher. Becoming a member of the portal also gives you access to the history of our recordings, as well as discount access on past and future courses. This year, members also get exclusive access to the Slovenian School Reading Group, as well as the year-long course focused on Deleuze and analysis. To learn more or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online.